Instagram page as well. Tonight's talk is Mark My Word, Building a New City. A lesser-known intriguing story of Masonic links to the establishment of the first city in the USA after the Revolution. After the Revolutionary War for our independence. Tonight's speaker is a published author of several widely distributed Masonic journals, participated as a keynote speaker in research and educational conferences on Freemasonry, and received multiple awards for his distinguished service to the craft. He served as the Junior Grand Warden of the Grand Lodge of New York from 2018 to 2021. He's currently the Senior Grand Warden for the Grand Council Allied Masonic Degrees of the United States of America, and the President of the Grand Witan of the Masonic Order of Athelstan, USA. He was coronated a 33rd degree Mason in the Scottish Rite and is an active member of the American Lodge of Research. He is a member of the Quatuor Coronati Lodge No. 2676 in the United Grand Lodge of England. He is a fellow and first vice president of the Philalethes Society, as well as a past president and fellow of the Masonic Society. Please help me welcome Right Worshipful Oscar Alleyne.
Can I move around, or you want me to stay here?
You can do what you want.
All right, thank you. Good evening. It's such a pleasure and honor to be with you, and once again in the Livingston Chancellor R. Livingston Library, where I've done presentations going on a few decades, if I'm not mistaken. So it's always a pleasure to be with those in search of light. I have a quick question. Are there any individuals here today who are not Freemasons? Okay, good. That helps me. Now, one of the reasons why this talk is entitled Mark My Word, Build a New City, it tells an interesting story that many are not aware of, and even myself kind of happened onto by happenstance. Specifically, let's see if this is working. Sorry, give me a second. It's not plugged in right away. There we go. Sorry, I know I walked in front of it. There you go. Don't catch a conniption. All right. So after the war for the American independence, a couple things happened. The British were not happy that they lost the war. And one of the biggest industries at that time in the maritime world was that of whaling. Basically, American ships, vessels going out, capturing whales and other seafaring animals for the purposes of the industry. The British decided to suppress any American whaling ship that was out there off the coast of the New England coast, etc. And this image tries to capture that. So think about it. The Americans won in 1776, declared independence, but the Brits still had the command of the Navy and their vessels. So they did everything under their power to not only suppress, to capture, but to force several of those U.S. businesses who were in the maritime industry to essentially say, hey, if you want to be out here, you either sign contracts with us or work with us, or we will blow you out of the ocean. So a couple things happened. There were two brothers from Nantucket by the name of Seth and Thomas Jenkins. And Seth and Thomas Jenkins decided to gather up their ducats, their money, and at the time it was roughly about $100,000. We would say the equivalent now would be a few $1 million that they had amassed from their wealth and their industry. And they wanted to find some place that would give them the security of having their shipping and whaling industry intact, while being protected from the British forces that are out there on the open seas. So they came down to New York City and then went up to the Hudson River, where they happened upon a property called Claverlack Landing, which we now call the Hudson. And Claverlack Landing is interesting because it was a former Dutch colony that was, let me rephrase, the Mohicans owned it, and then they sold it to the Dutch settlers, who then, Jan Frans van Hossen, essentially sold that in part of what's now Connecticut and Putnam County, et cetera, and it sold it to these New England merchants who wanted to find a new location for their port. So what they did, and I'm going to show you something that you may say, this still doesn't make sense to me, Brother Oscar. But what they did, they created a seaport up the Hudson River. which was essentially protected by land. Now, why is that intriguing, right? We're talking roughly around this time in the 1700s, late 1783. You had Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and the others. So all of this area was basically open seas on them. And they decided to come all the way down to New York and find a spot that they would essentially be able to maintain their subsistence as merchants. So they bought the land. And that land was interesting because the family decided that not only were they going to build a house, but they were going to form a consortium. And being from New York, basically they formed a co-op. And this co-op was interesting because other families, which they called themselves the proprietors, followed. And after settling and finding and buying this set of property, they said, we're going to build our city. And the city became essentially a major thoroughfare for shipping in the Northeast. In particular, even more, to some extent, even more popular than what we saw in New York City and even other ports for that matter. So 30 men signed the contracts in this co-op, and they became known as proprietors, and they founded the first city that was established after the War for Independence in 1770, and then the Declaration of Independence in 1776. This is just an image illustrated when these families came together, with these 30 families essentially, sailing up the Hudson River, coming from New England and other places, being not only men who were from Nantucket, but Massachusetts, and some even from New York City, essentially saying, hey, we're going to settle on this land and create this new city. That was on April 22nd, 1785. Where they incorporated the city of the Hudson, or city of Hudson, New York. And it's the first city, as I mentioned, that was established in the United States of America after our independence. By 1790, the population had grown from 30 families to 2,500 people. And from there, it really became one of the largest and very, very rich cities at that period of time. And we see by 1820, it had doubled. Now, I'm not speaking big numbers, right? 5,000. That's just a city block. But in that period of time, we're speaking about a substantial population growth, right? Now, this is where I want to really walk you painstakingly through this. Remember what I mentioned, the waters going all the way up to Nantucket. So this is Long Island, as you all know. They essentially came down, they passed New York City, past Rockland County, Westchester County, went all the way past Putnam, all the way up here. And this is where Clavelac, or what became the Hudson, was formed. So it's not like they just said, we'll just go up the river like across from Jersey. They went very substantially further up. And they found not only the port, but because the river at that point was very open and wide enough and deep enough to take large ships while still having that throwaway traffic going back and forth. And they set up not only their whaling system, but of course oil and any of the products that really came out of the whaling shipping industry. They really became a robust environment. Now, Thomas Jefferson himself knew Seth Jenkins and a few of these brothers because we understand they were very wealthy people. They were from Nantucket. They knew about, what was happening. They knew several of the patriots at the time. And even Thomas Jefferson tried at some point to convince the Jenkins brothers to perhaps invest in wine that's developed here in the U.S. versus going to France. This is one of the long letters that he wrote to him in 1791. And Jenkins basically said he wasn't buying it. He's sticking with what he knew. But one of the most interesting things, especially for us fellow Freemasons to understand, after founding the city, roughly about 3 years afterwards, the oldest institution that they created, and the first institution, was their Masonic Lodge. And this is why the story gets a little bit more unique. Hudson Lodge number 13 was formed on December the 18th, 1786, and was chartered officially by the Grand Lodge of New York on March 17, 1787. So this is one of our, early lodges, or within the early, development of our Grand Lodge of 1784. But remember, the first mayor of that city was Seth Jenkins, who founded the city, was one of the big proprietors, and he was also the first worshipful master of the lodge. Guess he could pull some strings. Now, as was mentioned, roughly about 1785, you had all these companies with whaling and seafaring men coming from all over. So they didn't just come from Nantucket. They came from Massachusetts. They came from Newport, even some from New York City, and they settled within this particular city. And what was really interesting is that they met this is going to be very intriguing for a minute. They met for the first time in the house of Brother John McKinstry. Are there any military buffs or folks who like military stories ever heard of John McKinstry? Colonel John McKinstry? Don't worry, I'll explain in a minute. Now, the growth of the lodge. 1786 they started. They started holding their meetings in that public house that first in John McKinstry, then they met in another brother's house, and then they finally set up a lodge specifically for the purpose of their meetings, roughly around a little bit after 1795, 1796. And that lodge was dedicated by our Grand Lodge roughly about 1796. And here you see there a society called Freemasons for the purpose of erecting a building suitable for their use, which must be 50 by 25 feet in size and must never be used as a tavern. No, I'm just reading the history. No judgment. Now, why is that? These men were Quakers. So there's a religious undertone over, now the irony is they were Quakers, but they also dabbled in selling liquor and other things, as we will find out. So, take things with a grain of salt. Now, the records of Union Lodge Nantucket, now I'm going back in time, just to illustrate a key point. August 7, 1775, it was voted by Union Lodge in Nantucket that Brother Winbrook, Samuel Barrett, and Chris Hussey form a committee to talk to Brother Seth Jenkins and know the reasons, if he have any, for absenting himself so long from lodge and make the report to the next lodge night. Just translating to current day language, Seth was not coming to lodge. And brothers were like, hey, you're not coming to lodge. So we're going to get a committee to go to your house and find out, why aren't you coming to lodge? They came back a few weeks later or a month later and reported that Brother Seth Jenkins, in regard to his absenting himself so long from the lodge, make a report that he holds himself a member of sincere respect for the craft and is ready at all times to pay up his arrears. So he's going to pay his dues, and he's going to come to lodge. But what we see, Seth has then, 10 years later, left Nantucket and now formed a new city and is now the master of this Lodge Hudson. Now, it's interesting when you look at the founders of Hudson Lodge, and I'm walking through this for a perk. Seth Jenkins, charter master, he didn't show up on the signature of the petition that we have here in the Grand Lodge, but we know he's listed as the first master of the lodge, and a member, as we just saw, of Union Lodge Nantucket in 1771. Another brother named Samuel Mansfield was a charter treasurer and a member of Hiram Lodge, which was in New Haven, Connecticut. You see the great span, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Nantucket, all the west. Thomas Worth, he was a charter member. He was admitted from Union Lodge in Nantucket. Robert Folger is an interesting guy. He was a charter member, is not on the 1789 list, but he appears much later in 1796, and we know him to be a member of Union Lodge in Nantucket. And in the fall of 78, he was shown to have been given instruction to take the Masonic furniture of that lodge and protect them during the height of several of the battles that were happening during the Revolutionary War. But it was also interesting, he was shown as being disowned later on by a Society of Friends group because he went to sea with guns. No, we're not judging, but we know that he was also present at the St. John's Day dinner in the lodge in Nantucket. Thomas Frothingham was a charter senior deacon, and he was also a member of Washington Army Lodge No. 10 in Massachusetts, and was present at the creation of the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, or a meeting of the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts in 1784. Joseph Olney, member of Rhode Island, St. John's No. 1. John Tenbrook. Those of you who don't know New York Masonry or New York history, Tenbrook was a very significant individual in New York history, and also with the creation of what we know, the charter documents of the creation legislation for the state of New York. And he was a member of Masters Lodge No. 2 in Albany, New York in 1777, and we see here a member of this important lodge. William Well, charter member also in the 1791 list from Providence, Rhode Island, and Shubal Worth, also charter member in Nantucket, and he is known as one of those men who funded the early American government to allow them, especially during the moments of fighting the Revolutionary War, to sustain their war efforts. So he had big pockets. So you see these guys, they were clearly men of value, men of worth. And when you look against the men who founded the city, versus the men who chartered the lodge, you see there's some overlaps. Several of them, and I put the square and compasses next to the guys there very clearly, but when you look at the composition of those who were the proprietors and the folks who started the city of the Hudson and those who started Hudson Lodge, there's a significant overlap. And here are the minutes and records from this Hudson Lodge number 13. And it talked about how they met. The Junior Grand Warden at the time was Peter McDowell under the date of March 9, 1787, and that the pattern was granted under the names of these men. It shows who the Grand Secretary was at the time, and Seth Jensen's Master, Jared Coffin, Senior Warden, David Lawrence, Junior Warden. And then it talked about the Senior Grand Warden being present and installing them in Albany, and then all the list of their members. They also talked about meeting in Brother McKinstry's home, and Brother McKinstry also recommended, and I'm going to get to McKinstry in 2 minutes, but recommended other people and going through the first and second degrees. So they didn't just start the lodge, they started initiating and created Masons. Here we get to McKinstry. Some of you may not know anything about McKinstry, but the following is important. This brother was a lieutenant colonel in the military and a captain in the Continental Army, and he was wounded in several battles. He was captured by Native Americans, and he, amongst other folks, other captive Continental Army folks, were about to be essentially killed and basically executed by the Native Americans at the time. And there was one individual who was also a Freemason that was a Native American chief who saw McKinstry, and McKinstry gave a particular sign, and that individual recognized it as a Masonic sign, and he stepped out in front of the other Native American chiefs and said, I'm going to barter for this gentleman's life. So he was right in the brink of being executed, and this Native American chief, Joseph Brandt, stepped up and traded his oxen and other materials to save McKinstry from being executed. I'm not sure if you heard that story before. Some of you may have, but there's a specific reason why I'm telling you this, right? We see that McKinstry not only cared for Brandt cared for McKinstry, and even after he basically was healed, then released him and sent him back. And McKinstry is now in the Hudson with these other proprietors and being active in Hudson Lodge. And we even know that later on, he and Brett met in Lodge again in the Hudson. So why is this important? Well, my brothers, I happened upon a document in my collection and review and research that had the following written on the inside. These are the minutes, old minutes found for Hudson River in a cellar vault on Thursday, 1939, and signed by such and such. But it says Mark Lodge minutes. And I'm like, well, wait, what is this? And in it, it lists Hudson Mark Lodge. But it also has the membership, if you compare between the Hudson Lodge membership that we know, and it shows some of the same names and the exact same names of the men who were active in the Craft Lodge. Why is this intriguing and important? It tells us a story that is so intriguing because we actually have the original records of these men who were operating this Mark Lodge on top of their Craft Lodge in the Hudson. Now, remember I talked about Joseph Brandt, also known Chief Tyenda Ekin. Brandt for short. Brandt was a very well-known Freemason, Native American. He knew George Washington very well. He even traveled to England and came back and was very well heeled between both the Continental troops and Continental government, as well as his own government being a Mohawk chief at the time. And these are the images that we usually see associated with Brandt. In my own lodge, we actually have a picture of Brandt in our lodge room because he is one of the well-known Native American Freemasons. And again, the story of him saving McKinstry is important. See what I just showed you? Now, this is the seal of Hudson Mark Lodge that appears in this minutes. And I pointed this out for a couple things. It tells the story, and I'll explain those who don't know Mark Masonry. It's another degree above the 3 degrees of craft lodge, not above, next to. And it really tells a story of you having a particular mark that shows the work that you've done in Freemasonry at that level. And it was very popular at that time. But they show not only this telltale mark that we can see, but this image here, you can very well make out this individual, this image looks like a Native American, right? And not only that, you kind of see like the burst in flames. You know, it's emblematic of the story of Brant saving McKinstry from being burnt alive and being executed. They made that their seal for their lodge, right? I was like, this is crazy to me. Now, they also, in these minute books, talked about, in 1794, they wrote to brothers in a lodge in Massachusetts and said, hey, you got some guys that are pretending to be Freemasons, so please be mindful of that. And, you know, just do your due diligence and don't let anybody just come in and say that they're a Freemason. But what about this mark lodge and mark degree? Because I know many Freemasons may not have an understanding about it. The conferral of a mark degree usually happened, as we know, within the ancient lodges, the Scottish lodges, or any lodge, or the Irish lodges, versus the modern lodges. Now, why is that important? The Mark Lodge essentially allowed, let's call it the 4th degree. It allowed a brother to not only gain further knowledge of Freemasonry, but get more information as he seeks Masonic information. And he also has to show that he's able to craft something that is individualistically tied to his characteristic and his being. And you see here examples of these marked medals that brothers would have become after they became marked Master Masons. And they would either show their emblems, something unique to them, and very similar to what we saw with the seal in the back. Now, the bylaws that we see, the earliest conferral of this grade was roughly around 1758, where we know that it was mentioned in Scotland, the cost of being admitted to be an entered apprentice 1st degree, passed to a fellowcraft 2nd degree, raised to a master 3rd degree, and made a mark master, what we would call the 4th. Goulds, in his research, illustrate that from about the start of the 1760s, it was evident that Scotland had several mark grades. There was a mark grade for fellowcraft and a mark grade for master. The point being, the mark master grade was something that was very important. And though we don't understand it as well because we have now put it all within what we call Royal Arch Freemasonry, outside of Royal Arch Freemasonry, technically speaking, this was always done within a lodge environment. What do I mean by that? We are all members of a lodge. We open our lodge on the 1st degree or the 2nd degree or the 3rd degree, or when we close it, then we open up, okay, a number of us are now going to open up the Mark Lodge. And then we're going to make certain members of our other lodge members of the Mark Lodge. So it was all embedded under that umbrella and usually practiced with that in mind. Now, why is this interesting? Because of the difference in how we now understand how Mark Lodge or Mark degrees are practiced. In particular, the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania is stated to be the oldest Grand Chapter Pennsylvania, the oldest Royal Arch Grand Chapter in the U.S., formed around 1795. Remember, just pay attention to these dates. The General Grand Chapter of North America, which is the grand body for all, nationally, all Royal Arch, was formed in 1797 in Boston and officially created in 1798. Now, what is interesting, New York forms its grand chapter on March 14, 1798 in Albany by 5 Royal Arch chapters. Look at the names of the chapters: Hudson, Temple, Horham, Hibernian, and Montgomery. That's our guys. They were part of the original foundation of what is now known as the Grand Chapter of Royal Arch in New York. But how? Right? They had Craft Lodge, they had a Mark Lodge. How did they have a Royal Arch chapter? Because the ancients and those who practice ancient masonry believed that you have the 3 degrees and then you get the Royal Arch to complete what they call the Masonic journey. And that was the typical battle between the moderns and the ancients, where the Royal Arch stood in the whole history and the connection of Freemasonry. So what is intriguing, the Grand Chapter at that time issued two types of warrants when they were created for New York. 1798, they created a Mark Master Lodge, charters for Royal Arch chapters. But at that time, there were other Mark Lodges and Royal Arch chapters that existed before the Grand Chapter. We just showed you Hudson. In New York City, the same thing happened. There were several Royal Mark Lodges and others that were embedded or, say, tied to craft lodges that just said, you know what, we're older than you. We don't know where you came from. Okay, you guys formed, but we're not going to pay attention to you. We're going to do our own thing. So they essentially gave these guys an ultimatum. You need to come with us or cease to exist. And typical New Yorkers said, yeah, screw you. So it took, right? They said that in the early 1800s. It took to 1802, several years later, when they declared that they're going to cut off all correspondence with these errant older chapters and Mark Lodges and forbid them to confer any more grades within New York. They also kept two spots open for these old guys to basically, older chapters to get number one and number two, instead of putting them at the end of the line. So the whole point is this: finally, they shut down the independent Mark Lodges and Royal Arch Lodges, and they all now formed under the Grand Chapter of New York. But this is important because when we think about this new city, this is what the Hudson looks like now. It only takes about hour and a half, 2 hours to drive, 2 hours by train. Very scenic, very beautiful. There's some beautiful vistas. There's one of the great artists of our time who's from New York and who's painted Niagara and North Atlantic and other things. You know, you can go tour his home and see these beautiful vistas. You have this really unique lighthouse that's in the middle of the Hudson, which speaks to the time when this was a major thoroughfare. And my brothers, this is that book that I was able to procure that tells the story of this Hudson Mark Lodge that otherwise we would never have known because it has basically been lost to our history. Thank you. Questions?
Okay, so when you ask for a question, raise your hand, and don't grab the mic. I'll just hold it in front of you.
Just of interest, the 4 or so other Mark Lodges at the time,
Yeah.
where were the locations, Horeb and all that?
They were in New York City. Oh, wait, the chapters or the Mark Lodges?
You had a list.
The list of were the chapters that form the Grand Chapter of New York.
Yeah.
The Mark Lodges that were also existent in New York City were not them, because those were what I listed were the founding chapters.
How many of them were across the East River?
Hold on. Sorry, bear with me here. So Hudson was up. Montgomery would have been.
That would be by Fulton or Fonda?
Yep. And Hibernian and Hummer, I believe those would have been in the Albany region.
Okay. So possibly Temple then?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank
Now, I'm glad you asked the question, because one of the things about the Hudson, when there was a contest to see who was going to become the state's capital, Hudson lost to Albany by 5 votes. So had there been 5 votes, Hudson would have been the capital of New York State.
And I'm wondering if my Van Valkenburgs were part of that.
Quite possible.
Okay, let me come around.
I find it interesting, your tale of Joseph Brant,
Yes.
Native American,
Yes.
in the craft.
Yes.
That seems a little strange, yeah? How was Brant initiated into the craft?
Yeah. So it's an interesting question, because a lot of people have difficulty in aligning the fact that there were Native Americans who were Freemasons, right? And we know that there are several that did. Many of these men were distinguished men, within both the Native American Society, in our society, and of course within that regard. So Brant, for example, because he was such a significant figure with the Mohawks up basically north, there was a lot of battles, or I should say, diplomatic overtures made to the Native Americans to get them on either side. So
English.
and the Americans, English and the folks who were the patriots. So in fact, that's one of the things that Brant, though he had a great relationship with George Washington, he essentially switched sides several times and went against the patriots and sided with the English. You know, it all depends on who gave who the better deal. But Brant was very well respected, and we know that he became a Mason, we believe, in England when he went over to England to meet with the king and the royalty at that time. Our understanding is that was where he was made a Freemason, in England by the Brits. We also know that there are others further north, and some, of course, Oklahoma, et cetera, who were also made Masons within that same construct, were either from colonial lodges or lodges that were tied to the American colonies at the time. Yep.
Oscar, I have a question.
Sure.
So today in England, there's still Mark lodges and actually a Mark Grand Lodge, correct?
Yes.
Were there individual Mark Master lodges and Royal Arch lodges? How are they organized? How, what was the separation?
To England or here?
In America.
So in America, the way it run, we would have, let's go back to Hudson Lodge. Hudson Lodge number 13 was formed. Hudson Lodge operated at the time. There wasn't a uniform ritual as we now have in the Grand Lodge of New York. You practiced the ritual that you were essentially worked within your understanding of Freemasonry. So if you descended from an ancient lodge, you would practice ancient Masonry. If you descended from a modern lodge, you would practice modern Masonry. Key point to give as an example. When the first Provincial Grand Lodge of New York was formed in 1781, roughly then 1782, it really was an ancient Grand Lodge. It was an Athol. Modern lodges like St. John's, in order for them to become part of it, they had to be healed, which meant they would tell them, we will give you the ancient mysteries because we don't care about what you know if you're moderns, just as a perspective. Now, taking that back to Hudson. Hudson Lodge, in our great understanding, they would perform the 3 degrees of Masonry, and when they ended their meeting, they would then say, let's say 9 brothers or 12 brothers, everyone else who was not at that level, we are now going to open up a Mark Lodge. So they didn't necessarily have a separate Mark charter. They just knew that because of the way their Masonry was organized, they had the ability to create a Mark Lodge that was embedded with their craft lodge. So they just looked at it as a extension of that. And we see this in history. In North Carolina, for example, I was able to show several brothers that you had Mark lodges and Royal Arch chapters that were embedded with your craft lodge before the 1800s. Once the General Grant chapter and all the ones tried to exert their authorities, you see them go away. But before that, from the mid 1700s to the early 1800s, they were operating all within one umbrella of saying, we are a lodge, we can practice all of these decrees because they're embedded under our warrant.
So did the Mark lodges confer the most excellent master and the Holy Royal Arch degrees
No.
as we know it now? That was separate?
They didn't do excellent master. They did Mark, Pass, and Royal Arch.
Got it.
So you would see in the records, we closed the craft lodge in 3rd degree of Masonry. We opened a Mark Lodge, and we made Brother John a Mark Master Mason. Then we closed that, and we opened up a Past Masters Lodge, a Lodge of Past Masters, and we made Brother Joseph a Past Master. We closed that March, and we opened up a Royal Arch chapter, and we made Brother Joseph a Royal Arch companion.
Interesting. So did they ever, for the sake of overgeneralization, ever called a Mark Lodge and they were conferring the other ones, or did you always refer to it as a Mark Lodge, a Past Master
Correct.
Lodge, and a Holy Royal Arch Lodge?
A Royal Arch chapter, yes. So what transpired over time is that Mark itself became, especially in England, became so sustained. That's why you now have a Grand Master, a Grand Lodge of Mark Masons in England that is separate from the Grand Lodge and is separate from the Grand Chapter. So that's how the growth of it happened in England. In the U.S., Mark basically got captured under the Royal Arch and basically did not have the same distinction as it did before that formation.
So Mark Lodges only did the Mark.
Correct.
degree. Got it. Thank you. Awesome. Very fascinating. Anybody have any other questions?
I just had a question related, because I'm a member of Ancient Chapter number 1, which technically I think in a way predated the Grand Chapter. So I don't think it was originally one of those founding ones in the thing. But you mentioned that there were some that didn't connect with the Grand Chapter, right?
Correct, and that was one of them.
Oh, okay. Because I think I remember seeing that the date of their thing was a little bit later than the formation of the Grand Chapter. So I always kind of wondered why.
Remember I mentioned that there were a few that were not, there were a few that didn't recognize the authority. There were two chapters in New York City in particular who said, screw you, we don't care what you did. And then later on, over the course of time, they were brought in. But they fought it for several years because they were doing their own thing. They existed. They didn't have this authority to assert in their mind. Who are you to come exert an authority over us that we didn't have before? We were able to make Brother John, Brother Joe, Brother Patrick Royal Arch Masons without having to deal with this new authority. And typical New Yorkers, no one could tell us to do anything.
That's totally true. I have another question for you, Oscar. So in the library, just to back up if this is true or not, and maybe expound on it, at the library we say that when we think of Livingston as the first Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of the State of New York, because that was at that time when he became Grand Master, and the two before him was the Provincial Grand Lodge of New York. And then when he's made the Grand Master in 1784 after the Revolution, finally in 1787 he closes the Provincial Grand Lodge of New York, and he opens up the Grand Lodge of the State of New York, thereby forming the first technical amalgamation of the ancients and moderns, which didn't fully heal until 1813, 26 years later in England. How true is that was like the first amalgamation of the ancients and moderns, at least in New York, and how did that affect the lodges and the ritual?
Yeah. So there's not going to be an alignment of ritual with those early aberrations because of how, you're talking about a large space also concentrated in New York City, then the country lodges, etc. But in New York City, the Provincial Grand Lodge that was first created were created mostly by military lodges under England. And most of them tend to be ancient lodges. And that's why we saw some of their early activities was to create other lodges, to heal some of the lodges. In particular, they healed St. John's Lodge and made them from a moderns into an ancient lodge. Then what transpired, roughly about 1786 was when 1783, 1786 is when the Brits left. They just evacuated New York. We see William White, who was the first Grand Master of that Provincial Eighth Lodge, say, I have to leave, we're going to go to Nova Scotia. And the Senior Grand Warden, Deputy Grand Master, and all those folks, I had to leave very quickly because of their military assignments. But he just said, I am turning this over. We're going to leave our provincial charter here for the rest of you to, whoever's staying behind, to maintain and to exist. Livingston becomes the first Grand Master of the independent and the sovereign Grand Lodge of New York. He wasn't Grand Master of the Provincial Grand Lodge, but because he was a modern, he effectively did what we call that merger of the moderns and the ancients, because before that we were ancient. One of the other telltale stories, one of the Grand Masters who was in charge of the time, I forget his name, Robinson, I believe, he actually left to go to Nova Scotia, and he kept the Provincial Grand Lodge charter, that is our oldest charter, with him. So that's why our modern Grand Lodge charter becomes why we say we're free and accepted.
Because that was for New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, that warrant.
The warrant, the warrant was for New York.
Oh, the one before that. I mean, when the guy that ran off.
The guy that ran off was the Athol Grand Lodge for New York, the province of New York, the Provincial Grand Lodge of New York. He left with it. And I tell the guys in Nova Scotia, can you give it back? They're like, we can't find it. I know they're lying. But what then transpired, because we went sovereign with Livingston, and he effectively bring all these lodges together, both the ones that were ancients and were moderns, that's where we see the quote-unquote amalgamation in New York of the two becoming a sovereign Grand Lodge of New York.
That must have affected the ritual too, right?
To some extent, I mean, you know, in any beginning Grand Lodge, when you form, you have some growing pains, you have some, you know, folks decided, I want to keep doing things my way, you know, how are we going to deal with administration? How are we going to deal with, you know, the dues or the payments of returns? So, you know, there's always going to be, I mean, think about it. In Albany, which actually had some of the oldest lodges outside of the city lodges, they decided that they didn't want to be members of the Grand Lodge of New York for about 7 to 8 years. In fact, Mount Vernon Lodge, I think, went on for about 8 or so years before they became members of the Grand Lodge of New York. So ritual was never really canonized in the way that we think about in modern times.
Yes, good one. I was noticing, because I was just working on the 200th anniversary of Nassau chapter number 109.
Yep.
And we descend in part, some of the guys were part of a Mark Lodge in Brooklyn. That's
Yep.
why I asked you those questions. Some of the confusion persisted on up past the 1830s, because we're shown on the rolls, we had to go back and square up years that they said that we were delinquent. Is because they were paying into a body that was part of Philip's Grand Lodge. And, you know, that whole mess didn't clear
Reconcile
itself up
for
until
several
the
years.
Civil War.
Yeah.
I always love the story about the guys, I think it was not Liberty Lodge or something, where that bit about the tavern.
Yep.
Where the only way you could, the quickest way you could become a lodge was your guys all bought bottles of wine at that tavern. Boom, you had a lodge. But I found it interesting that they had to go through all this process. And, you know, we think about it now, it's like they were horse and buggy and had to go all the way up to Albany. And it was easy for them to be confused by who gets the money.
Yeah, and to your point, and appreciate the comment, you know, as we can't always think about things in our modern consciousness, because back then things were much different. And the way not only transportation, communication was quite intriguing, but they still got around because they were practicing masonry all over the state and were merchants, etc. I'm sorry, next question.
Thank you. It's fascinating. So, if I understood correctly, the Mark Lodge degrees were not exclusive to Master Masons because there were also fellow crafts. So is it like they were like parallel rituals as they were advancing from the first degree up? Blue Lodge and Mark Lodge?
So the example I gave was Scotland had a Mark Lodge for fellowcraft and a Mark degree for fellowcraft and a Mark degree for Master Mason. That was in the Scottish realm. In most of the English Masonry, the Mark Lodge was after the Master Mason degree. So I just give the example of Scotland, historically, how the Mark Lodge developed over the course of time. But here in America, since we were primarily based on what the English left us, the Mark Lodge was you only became a Mark Mason if you were a Master Mason. No problem.
Any other questions? Any other questions? Thank you. Let's give him a hand.